It's a real pleasure to be here today. As Gela mentioned, my name is Samir. I'm the Policy and Research Advisor at Innovate Finance. And we're a sort of a one-stop shop for fintechs around the UK. We have 280 odd members now looking at anything from policy to programs to promotion around fintech. So we have a globally focused membership, and we have, as Gela mentioned, our summit on the 10th and 11th. So if you're free, please do join us. If I could ask our two panelists to join us on stage, that would be great. So we've got Ed from Free Agent and Colin from Float. Lovely. So we've had a couple of really interesting panels already today. A lot of this is focused on what I really love as the idea of building the rails beneath open banking, but not necessarily picking up upon what the trains are that will run on open banking. So being open to the fact that we may see use cases that we haven't quite envisaged yet, much like has been mentioned before. We've also spoken about the impact for consumers as well. So the idea is how do you actually get buy-in from consumers? The idea here is, certainly with open banking, is we don't actually know what some of those use cases might be. So how do you actually get consumers interested in a product like that? So guys, if we wouldn't mind having a quick introduction from both of yourselves.
Yes, I'm Ed Molyneux. I'm the founder and CEO at Free Agent. So we've been around for just a little bit over 10 years. We do cloud accounting for micro businesses and freelancers. We have about over 50,000 paying customers, primarily here in the UK. We have about 125 staff over in Fountain Bridge, which is about a mile that way. And we've been growing pretty well. We floated the company in November of last year on the AIM market, the junior market of the London Stock Exchange, and we're just starting to, over the last year, really build relationships with some of the bigger banks. We have a partnership with the Royal Bank of Scotland, which we launched in January, and is going to be growing for us, hopefully quite meaningfully during the course of this year. Lots of other conversations going on with other banks as well. So we're sort of at the consuming the data end of the open banking story and trying to deliver that turn that into value for our very tiny business customers.
Great. So Float is a cash flow forecasting and budgeting solution for businesses. Interestingly, talking about APIs, the whole story of Float came from us using Edge product Free Agent and then deciding we could access the API and actually do something useful with the data. So obviously the API world is very close to our heart. Our whole product is built on using other APIs, and so we want to try and add value and really focus in on where your money's going, help business budget, collaborate over budgets, and present that information back to the business on the board.
Lovely. So today's panel is focusing on what does open banking mean for business, and so exploring how banks can innovate faster, but also that idea of fintech collaboration as well. So what are some of those potential challenges, opportunities, but also what does the future of open banking present for young businesses such as yourselves? So with that being said, the format will be a few questions from myself, and again, if you've got any questions, please put up your hand. Otherwise, we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions, hopefully, as well. So perhaps we could start with some opening remarks from you guys on just what it is that open banking is and what it isn't, in your opinion, and what opportunity you see open banking presenting specifically from an SME perspective. I think sometimes we don't want to oversell something and not quite fully realize what open banking is. So perhaps, Colin, you could start.
Yeah, I think certainly from our point of view, there's a lot to be yet seen from what we're going to be able to get as a business from the open banking. We have banks approach us quite often, and there's a real challenge, and obviously there's the Nesta challenge, which is coming up, which is claiming to give early access to the APIs, which is very interesting to us. However, taking a huge proportion of your time and refocusing on what we could get without the knowledge of what we're actually going to be able to get is a real risk for any small business. Obviously we want to do things in real time. We don't know if we're going to be able to do that in real time. We don't know if we're going to be able to do it differently for all the 9 different banks. So do we work with some and not others? Who's responsible for the issues with that? Can it be a service that businesses are going to rely on? So there's a huge amount of questions for thinking about integrating. I think one of the biggest opportunities is actually somebody coming and abstracting that away from direct businesses. So something like Yodlee does for in terms of scraping the data. Is there going to be a service that comes and almost competes with that and actually takes away all the pain and presents it to us in a nice way so we don't have to worry about it? I think that's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, so being in the accounting space for small businesses. It's a different space from consumer, from personal finance management, because it's much less optional. You have to pay your tax pretty much on time, otherwise eventually you go to prison. And personal financial management has always had a bit of a lower profile, at least here in the UK. And this is coming from me, and as someone who used to leave my bank statements unopened for months at a time back in the day. So there isn't that much incentive for people to use personal financial management products as much as there is business accounting products, because it's your livelihood that you're protecting. And for us, we've used bank transaction data from Yodlee as a screen scraping data aggregator for a few years now, and we've had a relationship with Barclays Bank in the past. We have a bespoke feed from them, and now the Royal Bank of Scotland, and hopefully others soon. And the ability to access that data even in a daily cycle makes a big difference to the engagement level that our customers have with the products, because as opposed to your accounting system being something that you might dive into every month or maybe quarter or perhaps even once a year, you're getting daily information in, and it makes the whole thing feel much more real time, and people can be much more on top of the numbers. And so the vast majority of free agent customers are in the accounting system at least once a week compared to sort of quarterly or yearly. So it makes a big difference. And so from one point of view, open banking doesn't make that much difference because we already have the data. It's collected in a particularly clunky way, and it's fragile. And Yodlee aren't always anybody from Yodlee here? Yodlee aren't always the best at updating their screen scraping agents when inevitably the banking websites change, and so it can be flaky, but it's there. And what we'll see instead is a much more reliable, less flaky, and I guess just a bit more legally clean way of accessing data, at least in the way that we currently get it, which would be great, and that makes life a lot easier for us and for our customers. Whether then banks build any more on top of that remains to be seen, and we're having those conversations right now. What's really interesting in our conversations we are having with banks is they talk a lot about loyalty, and so our closest conversation is with the Royal Bank, and they have 750,000 customers, which is great. And but they talk about how loyalty is a very important thing for them. I guess I would argue, it's no secret that they probably lost a fair chunk of trust from many of their customers over the last number of years, and perhaps banking as a profession isn't quite as highly regarded as it was perhaps 10 years ago. So I think it is perhaps more inertia than loyalty that's really driving the retention of those relationships, and that will change, I think, as the Competition and Markets Authority remedies really come to the fore. And what we're seeing instead is, we look at both consumer challenger banks, but also interesting propositions like Tide, which is a new business challenger bank, which isn't really a bank at all. It's built on a MasterCard payments infrastructure with a sort code and account number. So it looks like a current account, but it is really just an experience layer on top of an existing infrastructure. And what the banks, I think, the existing banks are concerned about is that they will just become effectively boxes to hold money. And unless they do something about it, then the people building the experience layer on top of their money holding boxes will actually get access to the customer relationships, and they'll be the people who will be doing the lending in the future. And so you can kind of see behind the motivations of somebody like RBS working with somebody like Free Agent that the sooner and the more tightly they can integrate the more the deeper banking and accounting experience, the more they can defend against somebody really just cutting them off at the knees and turning them into boxes of money. And so it's as much about fear of that happening as it is anything else, because that is the mechanism, I think, by which business banking at least may well be disrupted by some of these challenger banks.
Great. So there's probably a couple of things to pick up there, but what comes to mind most immediately is what do you think are some of the challenges there? I think you've mentioned some of them in that successful implementation of open banking, but also what do banks need to do to be winners from this? So as opposed to just being the plumbing behind the scenes upon which fintechs or third-party providers operate above and disintermediate that trust relationship with consumers, what active steps can banks take to prevent that from happening?
I think the problem they have is that they are quite slow, and our work with RBS has been really evolving over the course of the last year, and that's quite fast for a bank to move that quickly. That feels slow to any startup. So the difficulty they have is really getting the technical, because the infrastructure is so legacy, they find it hard to move forward. Interestingly, the reason I asked Gavin that question about are they really on board with the standards and are they on track is because we're having these very strange conversations about almost bespoke open API access, which doesn't make sense to us, but they're sort of interested in building these things with us without the context of a standard that they are building against, which is either very just very odd, or perhaps they're just trying to get ahead of the game a bit. Who knows? And so I think they're going to have a hard job in meeting the timetable, and they're also going to have a hard job in really identifying how it is they're going to preserve the relationship with the customer if they don't do something a bit new, like what RBS is doing with us, and let people like Monzo, Tide, Starling effectively build a much more interesting experience layer on top of the money.
And Colin, what about yourself? Any thoughts on sort of what you need to see from open standard, but also how banks can adapt and adopt this new world of open banking?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a user, we bank with the RBS at the moment, and we've recently had to go through that next level where we move from the very sort of almost like commercial retail bank, small business banking to the next level, which is Bankline or something. And the experience difference is just, it's ridiculous how complicated the next level up is once you want to make payments of over £30,000 a day, which for us is payroll, which forced our hand. I think there's a huge opportunity for banks to rethink the experience. Already we wouldn't consider using the bank for international transfers of payments. We use TransferWise or something similar. So we put together a list, our own stack of tools, and I think the banks, there's a real opportunity for the banks to go out and look to work with startups, because obviously startups need funding. So I think we're going to see, I know Santander, Barclays are trying to do more in that space, but I just think, like I was saying, the banks are it's too slow, so they're going to have to find ways of working with startups together, and hopefully that will actually provide a real acceleration for the startups that want to move into that space, and the banks will get to be part of it and keep their hand in. But I think I do feel like you're saying the real risk is that where all the profits are going to come from is for these other small businesses that pick off these little bits where the profit can be made, and the banks are going to struggle to maintain them.
That's great news for startups, right? Because that's where the opportunity comes in. So we're kind of taking advantage of the fact that they feel like they need to be on the front foot here, but where banks aren't, or if our proposition isn't the right thing for everybody, which it isn't, then that's where opportunity comes in. And the difficulty there, I think, is that we have the luxury of having 120 odd people now. In fact, we work with David Stubley at 7 Elements to do some of our security work, which comes at quite a high cost. But that is the price of doing business with some of these banks. And I suspect for many startups that's prohibitive. And if there is a sort of two-track approach to the way they work with their API partners, where you get basically not very much if you're a startup because you're not trusted, and you get more if you're a more established, more growth company like ours, and that creates a problem, I guess.
And I think on that point, some of the work that we're doing as well is around sort of industry sandboxes with the FCA, and one of the constant areas of concern that comes up is around procurement. And this idea around standards around procurement, but also I think if you look at the SME Bank Referral Scheme, which I think was part of the Small Enterprise Employment Act, which essentially mandates that banks Should they not be able to offer credit, then pass them off to third-party providers, alternative finance providers. Again, faced a similar problem there. There was one vendor, one fintech, that constantly mentioned that actually they had to meet several different standards when actually there was a government standard in place for procurement. So again, we see some of these issues around procurement, around standards, around the multiplicity of them across banks as a potential barrier that needs to be overcome. Turning to the consumers for just a moment, again, this is building on Bill's point. We're constantly told to, again, look after our data as opposed to sharing it. So do you envisage that whilst we're talking about the supply side here, the rails, making sure that we have the standards in place, are we overlooking a demand side problem? How do we get the message out there? Is there a need for an education or awareness campaign to change mindsets around data sharing, specifically when it comes to sensitive data such as transactional financial data?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that it'll come through, the analogy of the electricity, I think it will come through when somebody says, here's the fridge, and do you want to use it? And people will say, yes, it's worth, I'll take the risk. And already people do that with giving up their banking password when they want to get bank feeds. So I think that's going to happen once the solutions start to present themselves. And yeah, I mean, obviously there could be real fallout from that. Maybe people will start to carve up their banking and say, well, this is the bank we'll take a bit of risk with. So it's just going to, we'll just use that for payments, and we'll do our payroll and we'll do our tax through another bank, which we don't connect up. So it's going to be interesting to see how that happens.
I think the transaction data is sensitive, but it's a little bit less sensitive than exposing payment mechanisms where money can be moved around. And the fact is, I guess, that the bank already knows your transactions because they have your transactions. So it's a little bit agreeing. So this is in the context really of when an RBS customer is provided with free agent as part of their business bank account. It's done with them at a no-cost basis, on the basis that they share data back to the bank from their accounting system, which for some people might represent a bit of a challenge, because that's data that the bank doesn't hold, and it may include accounts that aren't Royal Bank of Scotland accounts. But that's the quid pro quo, and the bank, in all of these cases where customer consent is sought, and we are being very transparent about that, people have to decide for themselves whether it's worth that, I guess, drop in privacy to receive the benefits of having free agent for free. And it's the case with everything that we do with our Google search histories and so on. And so as long as we're being transparent about it, I think that can be fine.
Excellent. And just one final sort of parting comment then. What do you see as the future for open banking beyond 2018? Do you think we'll see a future where APIs or the approach around sharing data is used more widely across financial services? I think that'll be the last one. So I'll leave it to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting ways this could go, looking very much into the future. We recently were given our SUN number from our bank, which was in theory going to allow us to have a third party make payments for us directly without having to go through, just to submit a batch report and do that. And I wonder if we're going to see people moving banks a bit more like moving energy companies. And will therefore there be some need and desire for a business to have their own unique number which they can keep while they transfer their services around different banks? I think there's a lot of potential around, I want to make a payment from this place to that place, and in a way, why do I need a bank to do that? So there's a lot of opportunity when you really put the sort of future goggles on. Whether or not this open banking will take us there or not is to be seen.
Excellent, finally.
Yeah, I think in the first instance, just availability of data for accounting systems in real time will really help us drive value for our customers. But I think just as we've seen, in consumer finance, the role that outfits like Money Supermarket have to play in dramatically improving competition between financial services providers. I think that will come to pass in business banking as well. And the opportunity to build whole new propositions, whole new business banks, I think will be irresistible to a lot of people. I think it will come at the detriment of the existing banks in the course of time. It'll happen slowly at first, but then I think all of a sudden, we might see the banking landscape as a whole, and especially the business banking landscape, very much changed in 10 years' time.
Lovely. Well, thanks again to our panel, and I'll hand it over to Gaynor.